So welcome to AgileTO Quick Talks. Thank you for joining us today. I'll introduce our guest speaker shortly and we'll start the presentation, but just a few housekeeping items first. So as always with Zoom meetings, please keep yourself on mute until you're invited to speak. Thank you very much. For those who don't know, my name's John. I'm part of the AgileTO organizing team and the team who helps put these events together and run them. And the rest of the team on today is Tom, Trish, Michael, Noel, and Jeff. So thanks a lot to them for getting this set up. We'd like to thank our sponsors as usual. So Wrangle first, who hosts our meetups whenever we're actually allowed to get together during healthier times, if anyone remembers that kind of thing. Wrangle's been with us from the start and gives us our location, etc. We'd also like to thank Agile Alliance, who supports our meetup expenses, and Squirrel North as well, who has helped us with Zoom webinars and logistics for some of our quick talks, etc. So the links for all of those folks will be in the chat. So yeah, just a reminder, this session is going to be available on YouTube after the event for you to review again or share with a friend. We'd appreciate it if you would consider subscribing to the AgileTO channel, because that helps us. Thank you very much. And also, if you have a few minutes after today's talk, we'd really appreciate your feedback. I will share a feedback link via the chat and a link to our YouTube channel as well. So just for anyone who's not been to a quick talk before, we typically take about 15 minutes for our presentation. And afterwards, there will be a chance to ask questions, which can take anything sort of from 50 to 30 minutes, depending on how many questions people have. So likely wrapping up at 6:30, between 6:30 and 6:45 today. Jeff Cossagew's online today and he'll be facilitating the questions. So if you have a question, could you please either post it in the chat or let Jeff know that you would like to ask the question yourself directly. And then when he's ready to have you ask your question, he'll let you know you can go ahead and you can unmute yourself and ask the question live if you prefer to do that. All right, so it's my pleasure today to introduce Amanda Stockwell, our speaker, who I've heard, I met at, had the pleasure of meeting and here speaking at PRDC Deliver Conference in Winnipeg. I know she speaks at lots of conferences and she'll be sharing her UX expertise and experiences today. So Amanda is a user experience researcher and strategy consultant. She's helps teams embed a lot of these practices into their work. So I think you'll find some interesting ideas in Amanda's talk today. And I want to thank her for joining us from North Carolina and sharing her wisdom. So Amanda, thank you very much and welcome to Agile Toronto. I will hand it over to you.
All right. Thank you all so much for joining me and for hosting me today. It's I wish that I could come visit you in person, but you know, maybe sometime soon we will we will get to that. So again, thanks so much for having me. I'm going to share some slides. So the usual 2020 couple of moments to make sure that I'm actually sharing. Let me know if you can see my screen.
Looks good.
Looks good. Okay. All right, great. So I've got 15 minutes, so I'm going to jump right in. So I'm here today to talk about Agile UX research tips. And since this is an Agile meetup group, I'm going to assume that you know that Agile is magic and it fixes everything, just like duct tape. I am from Maine, after all. Except even the really best tools sometimes don't have the best applications. And Agile is one of those things that, while really super awesome, can be really tough for the world of UX and especially UX research. So just to kind of put a little pun in, if you're familiar with Agile but not with UX, UX is kind of an umbrella term for a whole wide spectrum of different sort of activities and skill sets. And so I'm on the kind of orange yellow end of things, focus on research, really understanding people and potential products and concepts. Kind of the middle end of that spectrum is really the fundamental design work, making sure that you kind of understand how things flow and how things interact. And then the other side of the spectrum is visual design, all of which is important, but the part that I'm going to be mostly talking about today is the research end of things. And as John so nicely introduced me and mentioned, I am a consultant, which really only matters to you because it means that I get to see the way that Agile teams of all kinds, all sorts, attempt to integrate UX research into their teams and into their practices to varying levels of success. So I'm going to kind of walk you through some of the things that I have seen work really well, regardless of the situation. But I'm going to start with a little pro tip, a little secret, which is that there's no such thing as one right way to do research in Agile. Just like everything else, kind of the whole point of being Agile is that you have to adapt to your specific context, your specific teams, whatever is going to work for you. So I'm not going to give you anything that's like 100% magic and will 1000% work. I'm going to give you some things that I have seen work in lots of different kinds of contexts, lots of different kinds of teams. And I recommend that you kind of test them out, try them out, and see what works for you. So onward. The very first thing is that if you're the sort of team that uses a sprint or whatever cycle planning you use, make research a part of the sprint. Yes, every single time. Not like every other sprint, every 5 sprints. Once in a while, maybe you'll talk about it in sprint planning. I mean, like, no, it's always on Thursdays that you're gonna have user sessions or whatever. Whatever cadence ends up working for your team, schedule it in just like you would anything else. So the reason that that's so helpful is because if you have things scheduled along the way, you can't not do them. We'll talk a little bit more about how to get that actually done, but like thing number 1, just put it in the calendar. The second thing is make your own panel. So this can be tricky depending on what you're working on, but if you have a live thing that already has users, I super duper recommend that you start gathering a list of people that you could reach out to at any time for feedback. It can be, you know, there's lots of fancy tools that you can use. You can integrate it, like if your company already uses something like Salesforce for doing CRM, that's cool. Sometimes with some of my clients, it's as simple as a Google Doc spreadsheet. Obviously, I blanked out the individual material, so you can't see who those people are, but it doesn't have to be fancy, but it's really helpful to have your own panels. Because if you're doing research, for instance, every 2 weeks, you're going to pretty quickly run out of people to reach out to. And along with that is when you are conducting sessions, if they are moderated, which means that if it requires a person to schedule something with you, like I have to be there at the same time as them to run the research, I recommend allowing self-scheduling. This is a tool which actually, unfortunately, just kind of went off into the ether. It's called Powwow, but you can use Calendly or some other types of self-scheduling tools. And really what that does is it just cuts some of the logistics and the planning out for you. So especially if something is happening really regularly, you can start recruiting people ahead of time and have, you know, I currently right now, as we're speaking, I'm working on a project where I have research scheduled out for 3 sprints. So there's already people that we're recruiting for 6 weeks from now for those sessions. And then nobody can ever say, well, we didn't have enough time to get the people, or we didn't have enough kind of options for people to reschedule if they needed to. Go ahead and use the tool. Calendly, I think even the free function will work pretty well for you. Or if you don't have that option, use a tool that has a panel already in it. So an unmoderated tool is just, there's a whole bunch of online tools. Try My UI is one, User Zoom is another. There's a whole bunch of different ones, and a lot of them have built-in panels. They have access to people already. So all you have to do when you go in and set up the test is say, and I would like these kind of people. And you can get even faster access. Usually turnaround time is like a day or 2. When it comes to actually planning the research, that's all kind of like logistic stuff. When it comes to actually planning the research, be really specific, right? The most specific hypothesis you can to narrow down the scope. Because if you're running sessions every 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever it is, you're going to have lots of opportunities to do research. You don't need to cram everything in. So do lots of research in small little chunks. If you need kind of a prompt for writing a hypothesis, I really like this one. It'll probably look familiar to some of you. It's not rocket science. It's if we do build or provide this thing, then these people, those are the personas you're targeting, will do something you want them to. Maybe they buy more stuff. Maybe they can get through the process, like sign up process quickly, whatever it is. And we'll know that's true when some kind of metric. You need to, before you start your research, before you move ahead, decide what decisions you're going to make and decide how you're going to make the decision. So if you set a metric for yourself that, people need to be X amount faster, then set that at the beginning. And the more specific your hypotheses, not only will it be faster to plan the research, it will also be easier to come to conclusions later. But you can also kind of be flexible with the methods that you use. So you can kind of mash stuff together. So for instance, this week I'm working on some unmoderated tests where we're doing a little bit of like questionnaire questions, like surveys, and we're doing some click tests. We didn't have time to kind of separate them out and look for two different versions of people. We just kind of mushed the two methods together. Officially, this is called mixed methods, but the Frankenstein picture is so much more fun. But also aim to balance that flexibility with rigor. So one of the things that kind of gets dinged a lot in terms of doing UX research in an agile way is that you're never able to be rigorous enough. You're never able to include enough people. You never have enough time to completely do the kind of research that would be really helpful. So I really recommend, kind of working with somebody experienced and looking to make smart trade-offs. So for instance, if you're going to do unmoderated sessions instead of moderated sessions, look for trade-offs. Maybe you include more people, or maybe you include, like additional questions that you weren't necessarily going to. If you can, if you're going to do moderated sessions, but you can only do a really limited scope, you can kind of balance things that way. So look for ways when you're cutting back to make things shorter, look for ways to increase rigor in other ways or to increase the amount of information that you can find. Because the only worst thing than not doing any research is doing so little research or such crappy research that you actually make a worse decision. And when in doubt, recycle. So this is a fancy way of saying do some benchmarking. It is totally okay to do the same exact study more than one time. In fact, I really recommend it. For my clients who have live products, we call this benchmarking, right? And you can run, the same kind of usability metrics or usage metrics over and over to see how things have changed as you've improved them or as you've changed them. It's really, really critical actually for you to have that information, not just so that you can test teeny tiny increments of what you're working on, but so that you can get a holistic look at the big picture of what's going on. So I recommend having kind of in your back pocket a study that you could run at any time that kind of looks at the bigger picture of your product or the feature you're working on or whatever kind of questions you have. Next, I am really a big fan. One of the things that I love most about Agile is kind of the focus on collaboration. And as a researcher, one of the things that I love about that is that I get to include everybody in my sessions and analysis. So again, last week I was running some moderated usability studies. A PM, a designer, and a dev were watching and taking notes. This particular kind of outlet is called the rainbow spreadsheet, if you want to look that up later. You can do it lots of different ways, but basically finding a way to get everyone to come to the sessions means that they can learn along with you. So you don't have to go back and write a report and communicate back to them. They can just be right there sitting and learning with you. And you don't have to go back and spend a bunch of time to rewrite notes because your teammates already took them. And that is especially helpful in kind of bleeding into the next part, which is finding solutions together. So one of the big kind of dings on waterfall processes is that, a design team does a whole bunch of design work, spends a whole bunch of time making something wonderful and amazing, but that isn't actually technically feasible, which everybody hates. Nobody likes that in any direction. But if you work on finding solutions together, if you're kind of learning as you go, then you can also kind of brainstorm immediately together after the sessions and think of things. And one, you get the benefit of everybody's input when you're coming up with solutions, so that you make sure that you are, thinking of technical feasibility. You make sure you've got input from product or kind of the business side of things. And also, it means you never really have to do much convincing because everybody loves their own ideas. That's just how humans work. It doesn't mean that people are selfish. That's just how it is. So if you find a solution together and everybody's involved in that conversation, later nobody's going to look back on it and be like, oh, why did they suggest that? That stinks. They're all going to be like, look at our cool new idea. It went live and now it's making us more money or whatever. And I have a pro tip for those of you who are like, yeah, that sounds nice, but how am I going to get my teammates to log on? Well, I'm not above bribery. When I was in an office, I would bake. And my real pro tip is to half bake something. So my specialty was banana bread. And then I would finish baking it in the toaster oven at the office. And it smelled delightful. And you could only have some if you came inside. That's a little bit harder to do now that we're all working remotely, but you can still find creative ways to incentivize people to come. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then importantly, although it's awesome when everybody can come and watch and take part of it, I know that that's not like really realistic all of the time. So finding simple ways to keep everyone in the loop, I know documentation can be a dirty word, but I have kind of like a 5-15 rule. It can take me like no more than, it can take, or it should take people no more than 5 minutes to consume it, and me no more than 15 minutes to put it together. So in this case, I have kind of examples of a little spreadsheet that my team and I were keeping track of for the kind of research work we were doing every sprint, and kind of a summary email that we were sending to everybody because we knew that everybody couldn't be there for all of them. And really all it mattered was, here's what we did, here's what we learned, and here's what we need to do next, because that's all that actually really matters. And to that end, make sure you actually add stuff to the backlog. If you learn about it and you don't do anything about it, you just wasted a whole bunch of everybody's time. And sometimes when you're doing research, you learn, you have a really specific goal and you're like, okay, that interaction didn't work, but we know exactly what would work. Maybe you don't have to add it to the backlog. Maybe you can work directly with the design team or the dev team to just make that change. Possibly, but it's pretty likely that you already have some different priorities or something, and you're not going to be able to address it right away. So make sure that it doesn't get lost. Add stuff to the backlog. Otherwise, it's just going to go off into the ether, and you're never going to see it again. And I think I have not exceeded my 15 minutes. I may have even gotten a little bluff. So that's my doggo Grummer. Thank you so much.
Amanda, that was amazing. That was an incredible amount of information in an incredibly short amount of time. I'm sure that like many people, there's a whole pile of stuff that we're going to have to go back and watch again to process as we go through this. But a couple of things jumped out at me, and there's a couple of questions. So I'll just put a note in here, folks. If you do have any questions and would like to throw it in the chat, you can either send it to me privately, you can put it in the chat publicly, or if you do have a question for Amanda, just let me know, and I'll make sure that we can get to you if I like you, and if I don't, well, then I won't. I love having that part. No, seriously, let's get lots of questions. A couple of questions though, Amanda, that have come in already on this was, you talked about involving the whole team in this sort of UX research. How do you engage or help people, but beyond bribery, for folks who are looking at their, well, I'm a developer and all I do is develop, I don't want to do those types of things, or people sometimes get in those. How have you engaged with those folks to help them understand the benefits of hearing things firsthand?
Sure. So unfortunately, the best way to get people to understand that is to have them watch things firsthand. So what I actually do is, well, one, I rely on the fact that a huge part of my job is building relationships. I, as a person who is kind of the connector between the users and the business and the dev side of things and the designer, I'm never going to be able to be good at my job if I don't have relationships with everybody. So with that said, I prioritize, before any of the kind of like individual research efforts, I prioritize building relationships with people. And to be really honest, if you have a good relationship with somebody, A, they're going to take you more seriously, and B, I just straight up say, like, hey, Mark, or Susan, or whatever, like, I can explain this to you, but you're going to know more about it if you watch it yourself. And here's the other thing. I'm not lying when I say you're going to look at it with different eyes than I'm going to be able to look at it with, because you know more about, how the back end is structured or how we're passing the data or whatever it is. And I say, I need your help. I need you to help me out with this thing because I want to make sure that I'm getting it right. That almost always works. People like to be needed. And I kind of rely on the fact where I'm like, you're right. You are so much better at development than I am. I could never do that. And that's exactly why I need you on the call. So I kind of use that to my advantage.
It kind of ties into a question from Dory as well in the chat window that we've got in here. Beyond, engaging with the team, what tips do you have for communicating effectively with stakeholders?
Sure, that is a similarly hard question, and I'm going to kind of revert to a thing that I say all the time that drives people crazy, but the answer is it depends. It depends what who the stakeholders are and what's important to them. But just like how you kind of need to shift your product or whatever you're building to fit your users, you have to fit what you're going to present to stakeholders to what's important to them. So if a stakeholder is, like a C-level executive who's worried about finance, find ways to tie financial gain into what you're building. If your stakeholder is, like a technical team member, find ways to tie in, well, we might be able to save time in, again, building the database or whatever it is you're working on if we have your input now. I know there's lots of discussions about how to, like, should I make a deck? Should I make a presentation? Should I do video clips? And the answer, again, is just kind of like, it depends who your audience is and what they're looking for. So I'd really say to tailor that. But the other thing I'd say is that nobody's interested in reading your report. They want to know what to do. So I try to make things really action oriented, especially in an Agile environment, right? Like, no one really actually gives a crap what method I used if you're not another user researcher. You care what it matters to the team. Like, what is the team supposed to do now? So I very much focus on like actionable forward steps.
Let me come back to the methods in a second. I want to loop back onto those, but Danishka, and I'm hoping I'm saying your name right, had a question that tied in really nicely to this, which was, how do you measure or track the amount of research initiatives to show the research work to your stakeholders? How do you know how much to show them? And then how do you track sort of whether it's being useful or not?
Sure. So again, back to that kind of way of making sure you keep track of both kind of like what you're sending out and for yourselves and your team. If you're lucky enough to have multiple researchers that you're working with, or even just with your team, and I can pull it back up if it's useful. It depends on the project for me. Again, sometimes I'm very much tool agnostic. I say whatever works for your team. So right now I have a client who uses Notion. I put everything in there. I have some clients who use Google Docs. I have some clients who are, like all over the place. But whatever way that you are sort of keeping track of work and documenting things, and to speak to the backlog actually too. So I like to, if I can, to have a research specific section of the backlog, because then it's an easy way to track, well, how much have we done? And if you can tie like stories in the backlog about research to things that ended up being designed or developed, you can say, well, that is actionable, that is getting worked on now. In terms of the output, like the reports, that's more qualitative. You have to kind of just get feedback from people. I mean, sometimes you can get things like, are people reading the emails? You might be able to track that. But the other thing, the related tip that I have there is that I don't ever really like to just dump data at people, even if it's 15 minutes. I like to schedule time and say, I like to walk people through what we've learned. And then I'll send them the deck or the email or the whatever after the fact, because people just respond much better to people than they do to a deck of things most of the time. They can kind of use that for reference, but you have to kind of get qualitative feedback about what's useful to your individual stakeholders or team members.
That's the second or third time you've kind of touched on that point subtly. I'm going to move on to the next question, but I don't know if you even are aware that that's the second or third time that you've referenced the idea of, let's talk about what outcomes we have as opposed to what outputs we have. So I really like that you've talked about what impact is this having to our users and to our team about helping them do that. I think that's a great point. Behind has a question, and I apologize if I've got your name wrong, but I've just unmuted you. At least I hope I have. Maybe I haven't. But you put your hand up if you want to unmute yourself. because apparently when I click the unmute button, it doesn't work. But if you have a question, hopefully you're able to ask it. Yeah, go for it. Maybe. It's showing you still on mute. I'll tell you what, if you can figure out how to get yourself off of, oh, there you go. I think you're off. Oh, no. All right. If someone can help figure out how to get you off of mute, we'll come back to you.
I'll do it. I'll help them. I'll go turn it off. Let me know and I'll get it. I'll do it.
Thanks, Trish. In the meantime, you talked a little bit about the role of interacting with others on the team. Todd had a question here about the ideal relationship between UX designers and product owners or product managers. Tell me a little bit about what that interaction can look like.
Sure. Okay. So one fact that you should all know is that I am married to a product owner / manager who I used to work with. So my recommendation is get real close. Not usually that close, but I think that the UX researchers and designers and product owners or product managers naturally should be really tight, because a lot of times we might even be looking at the same data or the same, kind of looking at the same thing, but with a slightly different context. So I usually am looking at it with the, perspective and the point of view of the user. And a product person is usually looking at it with the perspective of, like the business or the, sort of like product market fit perspective. But those two things both have to be true in order to make success. You can't have something that, you can make something that people love and doesn't make any money, but you're not going to be able to support it for very long. And vice versa, if there's something that's a really good business idea, but it's an awful experience, it's not going to last very long because somebody else will come along and take your idea, but make it better, make it more usable. So I really recommend, I don't know if, I don't have, specific tips in terms of like how you interact or what meetings you're on or whatever. But again, I recommend being like as close as possible and kind of building an alliance and sort of a shared understanding of we're both the most successful when the other is successful. And so you don't always have to marry them, but I do recommend becoming at least pals.
Excellent. That's probably good advice. Don't necessarily marry them.
Not necessarily.
Good to know. There's an interesting question that's come up here about how do you engage with senior leaders in an organization who see their developers as, and I'm quoting right here from the question, as expensive resources who are paid to write code. And when you're taking them away to go do all of this nonsense that you're doing, they're not being productive. And so the question is specifically around engaging with senior leaders to help them see the benefits of the work that you do.
Sure. Okay.
And engaging with the team. Sorry.
Yeah, two things. So one, that sounds awful and toxic. And even though it's maybe a hard time to look for a job, I might say that you aren't valued there and you might be better off looking for something else. However, it is a reasonable outlook for potentially a business leader to look at what's happening and be like, what are you doing right now? What progress are you making? Because sometimes research looks unproductive, because sometimes the most valuable thing I can say to somebody is you should not build this thing, or like, stop, we have to pivot, right? So sometimes that looks like a lack of progress. But what I would say to that is, one, at this point in 2020, there are like, I don't know how many, probably hundreds of, articles and case studies of companies who have invested in user experience and done much better along. So, take like 10 minutes to Google and pull some stats, pull some quotes, but also try to do that in your own team. See if you can tie anything that you've done to, a measurable reduce in support calls. Or, if you work in e-commerce, like this is an easy example, but I used to work at Staples. We could tie directly what we had done to us selling more things. So if you can make those connections, and sometimes it's really straightforward, like in e-commerce, sometimes it's really difficult, but there are lots of stats out there about sort of the like numerical return on investment of a good experience. You could do things like look up, how expensive is it for your company to acquire a new customer? And if, you know, if you did a benchmark 6 months ago and you've made some improvements from experience and you're having less people, you know, kind of drop off, you can loosely tie that information together. So the key to that, though, again, is with any of these things is kind of speak the language of the person that you're talking to. Don't try to make them have to learn about UX and translate what they know into what you know. Translate what you know into what they know and try to give it to them in a way that makes sense to them. But again, I just want to reiterate, if you are working at a place that calls your developers expensive resources, just consider the environment you're in.
Yeah, I think many people work in environments that are on journeys, and that's how they may have thought in the past, and that still permeates throughout the organization.
Yeah,
really cool. You said something else there about adding things to the backlog. You said it both in your presentation and again in your answer there. You talked about adding things to the backlog. How important is it to remove things from the backlog?
Oh God, so important. So, because here's the thing, it is more expensive to invest in something, way more expensive to invest in something that you shouldn't be building than it is to spend an hour going through the backlog and getting rid of stuff that you're like, yeah, we shouldn't do this. And it's also important to reevaluate. So one of the things I didn't really talk about, I kind of touched on briefly, but there should be sort of a cadence of like small short-term learnings about, you know, say like specific design decisions or dev decisions, but also larger, more exploratory settings. So one of the things that I always tell people about good UX research is that if it's implemented properly, it can help you uncover opportunities. That's part of why you should be such a bud with the product person on your team, because if during the course of, say, interviewing people and you find that the user needs have really changed, you can go and talk to the product manager and say, hey, you know, we had this kind of game plan for moving forward, but nobody has flip phones anymore, or whatever. Or, you know, we've noticed that in our particular user base, you know, people are starting to migrate away from that piece of software or that piece of hardware, or they're, you know, whatever it is, whatever you learn about them over time, maybe we need to adjust our plan and account for this new thing that we've learned. And that is super important. And so getting rid of stuff is, it's a super important part of any Agile team, but I think it's best when it's informed by research, because after all, how can you serve users if you don't know what they need?
All right, so I'm just watching the time right now and it's 6:35. There are some great questions that I still want to get to. So I'm going to keep going, Amanda, if you're good to keep going.
I'm fine with that, yeah.
Beautiful. So if anybody does need to drop off, John is posting a link right now in the chat window to the survey. So thank you for joining us. And you'll be able to get the link to the survey for feedback and on future topics. Please take a moment to complete that. But if you're able to stick around, there are a couple of questions left here for Amanda, and I'm enjoying this. So please, please, hopefully you can stay. And the next one that I've got here actually it comes from Mayur. I may or may not be saying that correctly. Asking about the UX designer, you know, and being a key role on the team. You know, who do they connect with regularly? And Mayur, if there's more that you want to expand on who they're connecting with, and if there's anything more, please feel free to unmute yourself and speak up. But just wondering if we can talk about this, who this key role is interacting with on a regular basis.
Yeah. Thank you for asking my question. And I just wanted to, you know, elaborate a little bit, like as a UX designer, being as a in project. So what would be the role, the key role of the project, and to whom I have to work, you know, in regularly basis within the team or the project manager, as you explained right now. So just wanted to know the key role of the UX designer, where I need to spend more time towards as a task base, and to whom I have to work regularly in day-to-day life. Yeah.
Okay, so I think the kind of outline of that question touches on something that I get asked a lot, which is basically, how should UXers be integrated into Agile teams?
Right.
Or teams at all. Is that kind of a fair?
Exactly. Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple of answers because I have like an ideal answer and then I have the like real world answer. So I recommend to every organization that I ever work with that they ought to have both a UX designer and a UX researcher, and potentially some other specialties depending on what they're working on, but at least those two kind of major groups of people embedded on each of their Agile teams. So, you know, if you might have a person who's more focused on back-end dev, you might have a QA person, you might have a person who's more focused on front-end. I think that it's best when there are both a researcher and a designer embedded on the team. There's lots of reasons for that, which I will spare you all the details of now, but that's my number one recommendation. That is not really a lot of times available to teams. So kind of the next best thing that I recommend is that every team has a UX person of sorts, probably more on that design end of the spectrum than the research end of the spectrum, and maybe a small team of researchers that can serve a bunch of different teams. The kind of very key thing is that the person doing research about a thing should not be the same person who designed the thing, because you can't help it when you built something, you love it, and it's really hard to be unbiased when you study something that you've designed yourself. If that is not an option, and you just have designers, but you don't have any like, you know, kind of, or generalists, but you don't have any specific research people, I recommend that designers from individual teams pair up with each other and kind of do research and study, you know, test on each other's work. Again, because if you're usability, for instance, usability testing something that you built, it's much harder to be unbiased than it is if you're kind of working with somebody else. Plus it means that if you know, like need to take a vacation or you know, want to take a vacation, or you need to take a day off for some reason, you have some backup and there's somebody else other than who's on your team to kind of interface with. But I would say kind of regardless of what of those options you have available, or maybe there's just one kind of poor, sad UX person for a whole bunch of dev teams. If so, I feel for you. And I recommend one, lobbying hard to get somebody else to play some of the roles of researcher or designer, even if it's not officially their role. Again, it's another reason to make friends with product people. They often have research skills. And so you can partner with them to kind of have them do some of that stuff. Or maybe there's like a front-end developer who used to be a designer who's like, hey, you know, like maybe I could take on some of that lift for you. But in terms of collaboration, I sort of just as my ethos, I'm a person who thinks that everybody should collaborate as much as possible. I recognize that you still need some like heads down time to write reports or write code or whatever. But I kind of think that the key person you should be interacting with as a UX designer is everyone. Make friends, buy candy or beer or whatever, whatever works in your context. I say collaborate with everybody as much as possible, which is very long-winded. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your answer. Thank you so much. That's really helpful for me.
Sure.
We got a couple of questions left here for you, Amanda, but I'm just going to put another plug in if you do have to drop off. Thank you for joining, and please fill out the feedback survey. A couple more questions here to get through. There's a great question here from Justin talking about when we're walking stakeholders through the insights that we've got. Is that just a casual conversation, or do you actually have deliverables that they're expecting from you?
So it totally depends. But typically what I like to do is I've been a big fan of like putting a deck together, because I like to, sometimes you need words to describe something, and sometimes a picture or a video clip would be much more effective. Ask me later, I can tell you a whole story about a single like clip from a video that at my first job, we changed like the entire backlog because somebody was crying almost. So I very much like to have something tangible to kind of walk people through, but I like to make sure that I'm talking to them while I'm doing it and referencing things, whether it's, you know, an image or a video clip or whatever. And also people learn in different ways. Some people, you know, kind of are more audible learners. Some people are more visual learners. Some people need to be able to read text. So I also like to try to kind of reiterate the same points multiple times and in different ways so that they get absorbed. But I always like to have a conversation and something tangible to look at so that we can kind of talk through, ask questions, they can absorb it in different ways. And then they also have something to reference later, because let's be honest, what you talk about in a 15 or 20 minute session, or even a 1 hour session, no matter how interesting or insightful it is, I know that this is not the only thing on people's minds, and 5 days later, it could be totally gone. So they might need something to reference.
You'd mentioned a couple of tools that are available. There's a question that was asked, or that someone's curious about, tools specifically for capturing qualitative information. So things that we don't have numbers for. Do you have any specific tools in general?
Yeah, okay, so just to kind of, so that everybody knows, qualitative research is basically any kind of data that you capture that isn't a count. So in a usability test, yeah, you might be capturing like how long it took somebody to complete something, or if they were able to do the task or not, but you're also getting a lot of qualitative feedback about what people expect, or why they didn't like something, or actually, no, my preferences have changed, or I don't use that tool anymore, or whatever. Qualitative data analysis it's just hard. So let me just say that. But there's two parts. There's the collecting the qualitative data, and if we're talking about remote stuff, there's a whole bunch of online tools, but my go-to favorite is just to use Zoom and talk face-to-face and share screen if we need to, or, sometimes you like use the breakout rooms, or, some of the co-sketching kind of things, depending on what we're doing. And then for analysis, it depends a little bit on, even within qualitative data, what kind of qualitative data and what sort of thing you're looking for. So the way that I analyze a usability test is very different than the way I analyze like exploratory interviews. Because with a usability test, it's evaluative and you can have a really specific hypothesis. With an exploratory interview, even if you have a hypothesis, you might learn 1,000 things that you didn't think you were going to learn, and so you need to be aware of that. But so I do actually have a tool that I really like that I've been using called Tetra, where you can upload any kind of video file. It automatically translates it into like verbatims for you. You can search those. You can do it live and like tag them as you're going, or you can go back and watch them later and tag things, or you can search the text. And then you basically just like highlight the part of the text that you like, and you can make a video clip, and it spits out a URL. And so that and you can use, it's agnostic of whatever other tool that you've done the research with. And full disclosure, I am friends with Michael, who's behind Tetra, but I use it actually all the time. I could, and actually can I do a little shout out for myself? I'm actually going to have a analyzing qualitative research course coming out on LinkedIn soon. So.
Wow. How do we find out more information about that?
Yeah, sure. So I teach lots of things on LinkedIn. And so if you follow me on LinkedIn, I will post about it. Or if you're already part of the LinkedIn Learning kind of platform, you can look for my name, Amanda Stockwell, or honestly, just look for UX research. And I am like 10 of the, I have like 10 courses, so.
Cool. What was the name of that tool again? Sorry.
Oh, sure. Tetra Insights.
Tetra Insights.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So if somebody wants to find out more about you, is LinkedIn the best way to get a hold of you?
Yeah, I'm there all the time. But you can also tweet at me and I will mostly respond, or you can email me. But LinkedIn seems to lately be where I have ended up landing fairly often.
Amanda, this was amazing, and I know there are still questions out there. I actually wrote down half a dozen of my own questions, and I didn't get to any of them. So oh, no. I will probably reach out to you on LinkedIn to follow up. Thank you so much for your time tonight, and everyone, thank you so much for your participation and joining the AgileTO QuickTalk meetup. In the chat window is a link to that feedback form. The organizers love to get your feedback and know what topics are interesting and important to you. So please take a couple of moments to fill that out. we run these, they run these every 2 weeks. So we will see you hopefully in 2 weeks for the next one. Amanda, thank you again so much for your time tonight. That was amazing.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks everybody who joined, and I hope that you're all staying safe and well and all of those things.